I'm late. I had to stop by the Wax Museum again and give the finger to FDR.
We know Al-Qaeda, Zawahiri, is supporting the opposition in Syria. Are we supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria?
Well, it's a proud day for America. And by God, we've kicked Vietnam syndrome once and for all. Thank you very, very much.
I say it again, you've been had. You've been took. You've been hoodwinked.
These witnesses are trying to simply deny things that just about everybody else accepts as fact.
He came, he saw, he died.
Well, we ain't killing their army, but we killing them. We be on CNN like, say our name, bitch, say it 3 times.
The meeting of the largest armies in the history of the world. Then there's going to be an invasion.
All right, you guys, introducing the great Patrick Cockburn. He is Middle East correspondent for The Independent, and he's the author of a lot of books, the latest being The Age of Jihad and Chaos and Caliphate. And his latest for The Independent is called The Major Uprising in Basra and Southern Iraq, is what the world should be worrying about now in the Middle East. Welcome back to the show. How you doing, Patrick?
I'm doing good. Good to be back.
Great to have you here, and great to have you paying attention to what's going on in Iraq for us. So in southern Iraq, this is in the predominantly Shiite part of the country. These are supposedly the people, or at least their political factions, are the ones that control the government, and as opposed to the Sunnis, who are really on the outs, as we've seen. And yet there's major discontent down here in Basra. There have been protests for months, and it's getting worse. So tell us all about it, please.
Yeah, well, I wrote it because, there's lots of attention given what's happening in Syria these days, but Iraq has kind of fallen off the map. This happens every so often. I remember in 2014, people had kind of stopped reporting in Iraq until ISIS captured Mosul. And now this has kind of happened again. So we got these very major protests, the biggest in Iraq for years. I can't remember any of them like this, in which people in Basra, about 2 million people in the surrounding areas, all Shia, have finally decided that, they sit in the middle of this enormous oil wealth. 70% of Iraq's oil is around Basra. And they can't get electricity. The drinking water suddenly was always bad, has gotten worse. People have been, about 15,000 people have gone to hospital because they can't get clean drinking water. It mixes with the sewage, and the bacteria cause illness. There's a prospect of a cholera epidemic. So they took to the streets. They burned a lot of government buildings. They burned the Iranian consulate because they see Iran as being behind a lot of the local militias, which sort of often act as enforcers for the oil companies there. But, what's perhaps good about this is not an sectarian uprising. It's an uprising of people who, of Shia against a Shia ruling elite who they think are basically kleptocrats who are looting the country, which is sort of true, and are also completely dysfunctional. They had 15 years to hundreds of billions of dollars, and they haven't managed to provide clean water taps in Basra. So people are furious about that. If this was a few years back and the Arab Spring, the international media would be all over this. But so far, at least, they've ignored it. But actually, it's a quite optimistic thing that, the people are demanding their rights. And this is not a sectarian demand.
Yeah. Well, and the price of oil is back up, not to its high, but it's still back up quite a bit. And so it does raise the question of where is all this money going? Because it seems like, a lot of what you talk about is some pretty basic infrastructure that could be done for a few tens of millions of dollars and then get it done, right?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of reasons, or actually there are quite a lot of reasons, but two I'd like to highlight. One is, in Iraq, you have a sort of corruption. You have corruption in all the oil states. In fact, you have in most countries in the world. But, in a place like Lebanon, guys might be appointed to a job because, they're a Christian or a Sunni Muslim or something like that. In some other countries, they, because they have the right relative, but they take a rake off. But, at the end of the day, a road or a bridge might be built. In Iraq, that doesn't happen. The rake off is the whole lot. There's nothing there. There's no road. There's no bridge. Iraqi corruption is kind of particularly total. The other thing is that all the oil states tend to be a bit like that. You have a corruption at the top, and you have quite a lot of people plugged in Iraq. About 4.5 million people work for the government. They get a share in the oil revenues. You have some party machines. If you want to think about Iraqi politics, it's like sort of New York under Tammany in a way, that the party machines, they take over a ministry, and that's their cash cow. It's their source of jobs, their source of patronage, source of contract, and they run it in the interest of their party. They're not much interested in actually building anything. This has all come to a head, and I think it's come to a head for a particular reason, that before the fall of Mosul last year, after a 9-month siege, the Iraqis, particularly Shia Iraqis, were terrified of ISIS, that these mad jihadis were coming down the road to murder them and their families. So corruption, lack of public services, terrible traffic, all these things took a secondary position. But now that ISIS has been largely defeated, not completely, but largely defeated, then people have time to worry about, look around and see, what a tremendously shabby place they live in. Lack of healthcare, lack of education, lack of everything else, despite this enormous oil wealth. And they want to do something about it.
Right. Well, and so, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it for the moment.
Okay. Well, but George W. Bush created a wonderful democracy for them where the majority rules. And so at least in Iraqi Shiistan, these elections are pretty meaningful. Maybe, I don't know. I guess I read that the Sunnis were able to participate in the recent elections in a pretty meaningful way. And I mean, in the predominantly Sunni regions in Anbar and up in the north and all that, near Mosul. So can't they just throw the bums out and elect some new guys to their parliament, Patrick?
Well, when the bums are making a lot of money, and I'm talking about billions of dollars, they kind of want to stay where they are. Partly because they want to go on making money, and partly because they don't want to go to jail. Once you have a really corrupt regime, it's either the palace or the prison cell, and these guys want to stay in the palaces. So I think they'll fight quite hard to stay there. Mm-hmm. The government will also try and buy off people in Basra. They'll offer jobs and stuff like that. One of the problems in Iraq, even when they want to buy people off, often the money gets stolen in the way. You don't they're not even really capable of making payoffs. So it's a pretty dysfunctional political machine.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, so the wild card is Muqtada al-Sadr and his group in alliance with the communists, as you've reported, came out ahead. The two groups that the Americans historically, or two of the major groups, I guess there's a lot, that America's historically hated the most in Iraq, Sadr and the communists coming together. And their list won, I guess, the plurality and the first chance to form a government, and yet they've not been able to form a government, and it's been months now. And they did the recount, and the results were the same, right? So now what's the holdup, Patrick?
Well, Muqtada came out ahead and did well, but he didn't. They got 54 seats out of, it's only a kind of small, it's nowhere near a majority, so they have to combine with others. They were going to combine with the prime minister, but his because he did nothing about Basra, now they said they won't. They want him out, and probably they will get him out. We have this situation here. It's rather peculiar. The the U.S. sort of, one time was trying to, according to him, and I think quite truthfully, was trying to kill Muqtada. This was in 2004. But actually, he's always represented sort of a real nationalist strain in Iraq, which is anti-U.S. and anti-Iran. Wants to keep them both out. Muqtada actually told me a story. I saw him a couple of years ago, and he said the problem about Iraq is, that all the Iraqi factions look for sponsors abroad, and once you've got them in there, you can't get them out. And he said, it's like you've got a mouse in the house, you get a cat, then you get fed up with the cat, you get a dog, you get fed up with the dog, you get a tiger, and eventually you end up with all these animals in the house. You can't get them out. So, the comparison is here with Iran and the US and Saudi Arabia and everybody else. So in many ways, there's a pretty sort of positive development in Iraq. But, it's still a violent place. There's still so many tensions there, that you can't quite predict what's going to happen. A lot will depend also what happens in Syria. That's something that's never really recognized about these wars there. What destabilizes Syria destabilizes Iraq and vice versa.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we certainly heard those warnings from you from the beginning of the Syrian civil war about, I think you were quoting the Iraqi government saying that American support for the Sunni insurgency in Syria is re-energizing the insurgency in Iraq. And we sure saw that play out. So I want to switch to Syria in a second, but as long as we're talking about southern Iraq here, I want to ask you about the form of the police state there, because so much of what we talk about is the quote-unquote, at least, sectarian conflict, between these different power factions. But I remember reading back in the days of Iraq War II that the new Shia authorities in the Shia-dominated parts of the country, that they were almost as bad as al-Qaeda guys when it came to their enforcement of this really, harsh conservatism. I remember one headline in the Christian Science Monitor was, to them, a woman's smile is a crime. And they had gone around cutting, shutting down all the barber shops and all the liquor stores and this kind of thing. I just wonder, I haven't heard much about that.
Well, I think they're too busy stealing money. I don't, and they're not as bad as Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda killed or Shia killed almost everybody. They don't do that. I mean, they're pretty bad guys, but they're not in that league. But it is, sort of, it's very corrupt. There's a lot of people who want to steal money, and there's a lot of money to be stolen too. There's a lot of money in Basra.
Right.
So it's difficult to, you're attacking a lot of interests there. Mm-hmm. And so, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But it also sort of destabilizes the rest of Iraq. And of course, what they haven't done is close down oil production. Maybe they can't do it. Maybe they won't do it. But, they closed down the main ports. The other thing to remember about Iraq is almost all Iraqis are armed. The government and the police may be better armed, but actually all Iraqis have a gun. So you can quite quickly move from the peaceful protests, or the demonstrators were shouting peace, peace. They weren't carrying weapons. Things get rough, that could change.
Yeah. All right. So now, speaking of Syria, there is it looks to be the final assault on Idlib province, which is the last holdout of the formerly, I guess, CIA-backed so-called moderates and their al-Qaeda allies there. And I guess, I read reports, too, that there's still, so-called pockets of Islamic State fighters holding out in the east of the country, too. So, and then, of course, I guess later we can talk about the Washington Post article about how we're there for Iran from now on, and it's not even in the name of ISIS anymore. But what's left of al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria now, Patrick?
Well, ISIS still has some strength over in the east. They've been lying low. How low, we don't know. But certainly they've been sort of looking for an opportunity to make a comeback. So they're still around. But, they lost They lost Raqqa, they lost Mosul. The Islamic State used to be really big, used to be the size of Great Britain. Now they hold one town on the Euphrates. So they're much weaker than they were. Now, Al-Qaeda, you have these groups in Idlib. There are really sort of two basic groups there. There's a sort of Al-Qaeda type coalition in the north of Idlib. And then you have one linked to Turkey that contains sort of the Ahrar al-Sham as one group. There were sort of former jihadis, there's Free Syrian Army. Some of these guys used to be called sort of moderates in the past. And they're in the south of Idlib. Now, my guess would be if there is going to be an attack, it'll be sort of salami tactics. They won't try and take the whole thing. They'll try and take a chunk of it, probably in the south, because the non-Al-Qaeda guys aren't as tough fighters. They're a bit cut off from Turkey. They're probably easier meat to attack. So we'll probably see a situation where the Syrian army will sort of try and take it bit by bit, maybe reach some agreement with some of the factions in the south, like we saw in eastern Ghouta and Deraa and southern Syria. So this should take a long time. I don't think there's going to be a sort of mass panzer assault on Idlib to try and take the whole of Idlib.
So what do you make of all these statements by American officials about, we know Assad is about to use poison gas, and once he does, then that means we're going to have to do something about it? It seems almost too clumsy to be the setup for a false flag attack, except I don't know what else they could be referring to here.
Yeah, I find it a bit mysterious. And is it entirely to do with Syria, or is it to do with some, policy battle in Washington, between within the Trump administration, of those who want to intervene militarily, those who don't, there's bound to be that aspect of it. So you see the other countries, or Germany and France, saying the same thing. We'll see. Will they intervene? It's quite sort of, maybe they'll do something because, this has been a pretty major defeat for the U.S. and the Europeans. They may just want to show, we're still in business, we can still attack. But it's always been true that sort of single attacks, these are purely gestures. They don't mean much. If there was ever to be a serious military intervention, this goes right back to 2012-13, it would have to be sustained military bombing like we saw in Libya after 2011 against Gaddafi, or in Iraq after 2014. So that's the only thing that makes the difference. People sometimes say, Obama should have intervened, but they, what they don't sort of say is Obama should have intervened like we intervened in Libya, of launching a full-scale war, because anything less is kind of meaningless. And, of course, they don't dare say that because it would be very unpopular.
All right, you guys, here's how to support the show. First of all, subscribe to the RSS feeds, iTunes, Stitcher, and all of that. All the feeds are available at scotthorton.org. And also at libertarianinstitute.org. You can also follow me on youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. And sign up for Patreon. If you do, anybody who signs up for $1 per interview gets 2 free books from Listen and Think Audio. And also you'll get keys to the new Reddit page, reddit.com/Scott Horton Show. And then if you go to scotthorton.org/donate, $20 will get you the audiobook of Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. $50 will get you a signed copy of the paperback there. And a $100 donation will get you either a QR code, commodity disc, or a lifetime subscription to Listen and Think Libertarian audiobooks. That's all at scotthorton.org/donate. And also anybody donating $5 or more per month there, if you already are, or if you sign up now, you'll get keys to that new Reddit group as well. Already got about 50 people in there, and it's turning out pretty good. Again, that's reddit.com/Scott Horton Show. If you're already donating or you're a new donor, just email me, scott@scotthorton.org, and I'll get you the keys there. And hey, do me a favor. Give me a good review on iTunes or Stitcher, or if you liked the book, on Amazon.com. And the audiobook is also on iTunes, and sure would appreciate that. And listen, if you want to submit articles to the Libertarian Institute, please do, and they don't have to be about foreign policy. My email address is scott@scotthorton.org. Right. Well, I mean, that, I guess if they recognize that they have no good options, I mean, especially now, I mean, apparently all reports are that Trump really did cancel, and the CIA obeyed him on this, canceled CIA support for these groups back a year ago. And so it sure seems too late now to try to intervene on their behalf now that they're, completely in a corner. Mm-hmm. So maybe a couple of Tomahawk missiles to, as you say, kind of for showmanship, to prove that to prove they're still in the game, while at the same time they're really just going to go ahead, and they have no choice but to let the Syrian army and the Russians finish off these guys.
I think that might well be true. The Israelis kind of do the same thing. The Israelis said they launched this tremendous attack. They attacked 50 Iranian targets, but then the reports say that 11 Iranians were killed. So how come? Either aren't many Iranians there, or the Israelis weren't quite as serious as they claim to be. Mm. And it's similarly with the U.S. I think that this, this assertiveness is to show that, that Assad and the Russians and the Iranians may have won, but we're still a powerful force. So we'll see. Yeah, I think it's too late for them to do that, even if it worked. At the same time, it's sort of it's a question of really what Turkey does as well, because Turkey is on the border there. One of the main factions, which is like to come under attack, is basically allied to the Turks. The Turks have been sending in weapons to Idlib over the last few days. This would be a big humiliation for Turkey if their guys in Syria were wiped out. And so probably that's the thing to watch.
And by their guys, you mean Al-Qaeda?
No, there's another group which the Turks have been backing as a sort of alternate to Al-Qaeda.
What, Ahrar al-Sham, or do you know the name of it?
Ahrar al-Sham, and I mentioned the Syrian... Free Syrian Army, other factions. They're in South Idlib. It's a little easier terrain there around the north where Al-Qaeda is. This is very hilly, broken country. It's very difficult to fight through. So these are really partly controlled from Turkey in southern Idlib.
And so, what do you think Erdogan wants to do here? He wants to save these groups to use them against the Kurds?
Well, indirectly, he doesn't want to be humiliated in Syria. He remains anti-Assad. The question, will he have a relationship with Russia? Will this survive? Does he have an alternative? He wanted to postpone this offensive and said, he'd persuade, people to defect from Al-Qaeda to this pro-Turkish group. But there's no particular reason why they should do that. So, Erdogan is in a fix there. And, we'll see which way he's going to jump.
Yeah. So now back to the Islamic State guys in eastern Syria that are still there. It seems odd since, I know it's a vast desert out there and everything, but the Americans and their Syrian Defense Forces allies finished rousting the Islamic State out of Mosul, I guess, back at the beginning of the year. And we had, the Marine Corps and obviously Special Operations Forces on the ground there, as well as Iraqi militias, where they're the good guys on the eastern side of the border there. It seems like there are all these groups that it seems strange that there would still be pockets of Islamic State fighters that the Americans and or their Kurdish allies wouldn't have finished off by now. And, also, I guess there's been a couple of times where it seemed like the Syrian Arab army the state army was on its way there to attack some of these Islamic State guys, and the Americans stopped them and said, you're not allowed to pass, I guess, the Euphrates, or whichever line that they claimed. But in other words, the Americans seem to be de facto protecting these last holdouts of the Islamic State fighters, not using the Kurds against them and protecting them from the Syrian army. But I don't know if that's deliberate or not or anything, or just what is the story behind that? Do you know?
Yeah, I think it may not be so conspiratorial. There's no doubt that the U.S. and the Kurds want to stop the Syrian army advancing sort of further west. There's a place called Deir ez-Zor province. There also the oil fields are there. They don't want Assad to get control of the oil fields there. Now, you could say by stopping Assad, in a sense, that's the advantage of Islamic State. But I don't think that's quite the reason they're doing it. It's also true that the Turkish attack in Afrin, this Kurdish area up in the north, at the beginning of the year when the Kurds were driven out, that the Kurds may not be keen to eliminate all Islamic State because they want to keep this American alliance, which is directed against Islamic State. There's also just a thing, this is a very, very big area, that it's quite good guerrilla terrain. Guys can, hide out in these deserts, particularly if they pre-position weapons and food and so forth. So I think there's that element. This was a very, Islamic State at its height was a very big, well-equipped organization. It stands to reason that they have fallback positions and depots of guns and food. One can see some consequence. There are more attacks in Iraq now. There was one, I think, in the last 24 hours. A suicide bomber near Tikrit killed 6 people. So we're beginning to see attacks where we didn't see anything before. And it may be that Islamic State always wanted, to take a punch and then see if it could come back as a guerrilla force, very mobile, no fixed positions, and begin to expand again, particularly as its enemies, the U.S., the Kurds, the Syrian army, the Iraqi army, that all these people are divided. So it may see opportunities that it didn't have a year ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I read a couple of things recently about, I guess, what I'm calling Iraq War 3.5, where the Islamic State is, as you said, no longer a state, but it's just back to an insurgency again. Zarqawi's old al-Qaeda in Iraq is who we're talking about, and they're still fighting here, there, and the other place. I'm not sure where all. I guess they'll be flinging suicide bombers at Baghdad from now into eternity.
Well, yeah, there haven't been many. The last really big bomb in Baghdad was in 2016. It was a big one. About 300 people were killed. But there hasn't been anything like that since. They don't seem to have the capacity they did. On the other hand, it may be that they're sort of waiting to stage a big one. And certainly, Iraqis, although Baghdad is a much safer city in terms of bombing, assassinations, Iraqis have spent 40 years in crisis and war, so it doesn't take much for them to feel edgy, and feel, it just takes a few attacks for them to feel ISIS is making a comeback, everything's going to go to ruin again.
Yeah. So there's this report from the Washington Post from, I guess, Monday, about with quotes from James Jeffries, who's a Trump administration guy, saying that Trump's former statements that we're only there for ISIS and then he wants the troops out, those are canceled, and that we're staying in, I guess, Syrian Kurdistan from now on because Iran. The same reason they were supporting the jihadis there in the first place. Iran. So once the war against Al-Qaeda and ISIS that got too out of control, once that's over, that doesn't mean a thing. That just is some midpoint. But I wonder what you think their end is.
Well,
Because like we talked about, they don't want to fight Iran. They don't want to have a real war with Iran and Syria. They would already have one, right?
How serious do we take what Jeffries is saying? Rex Tillerson was saying the same sort of thing in the beginning of this year. We're going to stay. We're going to set up our own, border force. They had a whole list of things they were going to do. And then, shortly afterwards, Tillerson gets the push. I can't see the Kurds thinking just because Jeffries says something that's necessarily going to be U.S. policy in 6 months' time. In some ways, Trump's instinct that Syria is real trouble is correct. All these think tanks, all these State Department people, former and current, who say that Trump is naive, and so forth. When you listen to them, you realize they don't know anything about Syria or Iraq either. It may be that I don't suppose Trump knows much about the detail there, but his general instinct that, there's nothing but trouble for him in Syria and they might well be wise to get out, is probably correct from the U.S. point of view. And I think that, there's such sort of hostility to Trump, just like my mind, that people don't take on board that, the general position that the U.S. is best out of Syria is a pretty sensible one.
Yeah. Well, I guess the problem here this whole time, right, has been they keep doing these things, at least in part, to spite Iran. They can't really attack Iran, but so they thought that invading Iraq would somehow give them leverage over Iran. And then when that didn't work, it only made Iran more powerful. They decided, well, we'll get a consolation prize by taking out Assad. Obama even explained that to Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic, that's what we're doing, trying to weaken Iran by hurting Assad. And so that hasn't worked. That's actually improved Iran's position in Syria as well and made Syria more dependent on Iran than ever. So they're really frustrated, these anti-Iran hawks, all the neocons and all the pro-Likud guys and all the people in the State Department who can't get over the revolution of 79 or whatever their problem is. They can't imagine quitting the field now when they have done so much for their major nemesis.
Yeah, it's been very self-destructive, obviously, that why has Iran influence grown? It's entirely because of decisions taken in Washington, invading Iraq in 2003, trying to get rid of Assad, even in Syria, trying to, weaken Hezbollah, same thing. Actually, the influence of Iran in the region, is generally to do with the U.S. Sometimes, I was in Iran some years ago, and they were saying, it's sort of 2001, Iran had Saddam, who was very hostile to Iran on one side, and the Taliban were very hostile to Iran on the other, and the U.S. has demolished all these enemies of Iran. I think that all these things economic pressure in Iran, that does have an effect. I don't think it'll lead to a regime change in Tehran. But these military attempts, to get Iran out of Syria, this is not a sort of an enormous Iranian army in Syria. It's just the Syrian government has seen Iran as its strategic ally since 79, 79-80. That isn't going to change. So, this is just sort of really pretty childish. The longer they stay there, the Kurds would like an agreement with Assad, because above all, they're terrified of the Turkey coming in. But the US obviously doesn't want them to reach an agreement. So, in a way, you can keep stirring the pot in Syria, which is bad for the Syrians, but I doubt if it's going to do the US much good either.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you mentioned that the Rex Tillerson statement that never mind Trump, we're staying for Iran, I think that you had reported this back then too, but I think it was pretty clear at the time that that was what had provoked the Turkish invasion. That Erdogan had then said to Putin, see, they're staying. They're going to support the Kurds, just like I said they were going to, and not leave. And so now, and that was what provoked the invasion of Afrin, right?
Yeah, I mean, this was seen as a provocation by, as you say, by both Turkey and Russia. The Russians withdrew their air umbrella over Afrin and basically gave permission for the Turks to invade it. This was provoked by this kind of crazy Tillerson statement. That's what I was, the point I was trying to make earlier is that, crazy though Trump is in many ways, one shouldn't see, this narrative that's been produced that somehow there are adults in the room who are preventing him blowing up the world. The adults in many ways are as dangerous or not more dangerous than Trump when it comes to Syria and Iran. They're very militaristic. They're pretty ignorant of what the situation is on the ground. They have a very bad track record.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much again for your time on the show, Patrick. I really appreciate it.
Not at all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, you guys. That's the heroic Patrick Cockburn, Middle East correspondent for The Independent, the author of a great many books, including The Rise of Islamic State, The Age of Jihad and Chaos, and Caliphate. Find him at independent.co.uk and uns.com. All right, y'all. Thanks. Find me at libertarianinstitute.org, at scotthorton.org, antiwar.com, and reddit.com/Scott Horton Show. Oh, yeah, and read my book, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, at foolserrand.us.